Before we start, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. She noticed it first in the way conversations died when she approached. It wasn't an abrupt silence. It was that silence that seemed too polite, too rehearsed, almost kind, as if everyone there had been trained not to appear offensive while being exactly that. Smiles remained on faces. Champagne glasses stayed raised, but something invisible contracted in the air whenever she took 2 steps forward. The gallery was one of those spaces designed to intimidate through beauty. Marble floors stretched endlessly beneath crystal chandeliers that cast fragments of light across faces already glowing with expensive skincare routines and subtle cosmetic work. The art on the walls was the kind people pretended to understand. Abstract pieces with price tags that could fund small towns, purchased not for their beauty, but for what owning them signified. She had dressed carefully that evening. The deep emerald gown had been custom-made, flowing elegantly over her curves, the fabric catching light in ways that suggested both luxury and taste. Her jewelry was understated. A single strand of pearls that had belonged to her grandmother, diamond studs that sparkled without screaming. Her hair was styled in natural coils that framed her face with deliberate grace. She had learned long ago that presentation mattered, though she'd also learned that for some people, no amount of preparation would ever be enough. "Is she on the list?" Someone whispered, believing that low volume was sufficient discretion. She heard it. She always heard it. The question floated across the space between a cluster of women draped in designer labels, their bodies carved into socially acceptable shapes through means they'd never publicly discuss. One of them, a blonde woman whose collarbones jutted sharply beneath diamond-encrusted skin, turned slightly, her gaze sweeping over the black woman with the kind of assessment that pretended to be casual but was anything but. "I don't recognize her," another murmured, her tone suggesting this was somehow evidence of wrongdoing. The black woman adjusted her dress with calm precision, her posture perfectly straight, chin firm. There was no insecurity in her movements, only weariness. An old weariness, accumulated over years. The kind that settles into your bones when you've had to prove your right to exist in spaces too many times to count. She moved toward the bar, her heels clicking against the marble with quiet confidence. The bartender, a young man who'd been warm and attentive to the previous guests, looked at her with visible uncertainty, his smile a fraction less genuine than it had been moments before. "Can I help you?" he asked, the question carrying an undercurrent she couldn't quite name. Not hostility exactly, but a guardedness that hadn't been there for others. "Champagne, please," she said, her voice steady and clear. He poured it, but his movements were careful, controlled, as if he were performing a task he wasn't entirely sure he should be performing. When he handed her the glass, their fingers didn't touch. He'd made sure of that. "Thank you," she said, meeting his eyes until he looked away. She turned back toward the crowd, taking a small sip of champagne that tasted expensive and empty at the same time. That's when the woman approached, the one with the 2 sharp collarbones and a dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Excuse me," the woman said, her smile painted on with the same precision as her lipstick. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Victoria Hastings. I'm on the event committee." The way she emphasized event committee suggested this was meant to be impressive, authoritative, a credential that granted her certain privileges. "It's a beautiful venue," the black woman responded, deliberately not offering her own name yet. She'd learned this tactic years ago. Make them work for it. Make them reveal themselves first. Victoria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, well, we're very selective about our guest list. This is a rather exclusive gathering." Her eyes traveled down the length of the black woman's body again, lingering in ways that felt invasive. "I'm sorry, but I don't see your name tag. All of our confirmed guests should have received one at the entrance." "I have it here," she said calmly, reaching into her small clutch and producing the embossed card with her name clearly printed. She held it out without explanation, without justification. Victoria took it, her eyes narrowing slightly as she read. Well, with all due respect," she paused, and those words, "with all due respect," hung in the air like a warning. "I believe there may have been some kind of mistake. This event has a certain standard, you understand. Image, aesthetic, a particular level of exclusivity. Mistake. That word always came wrapped in politeness, delivered with a smile that never reached the eyes. What kind of mistake? The black woman asked, her voice level but with an edge now, a sharpness that suggested she knew exactly what kind of mistake Victoria meant. Well, I'm not sure how you received an invitation, but perhaps there was a clerical error. We have very specific criteria for our attendees. Victoria glanced around as if looking for backup, and found it in the form of two other women who drifted closer, drawn by the scent of confrontation the way sharks are drawn to blood. One of them, a redhead with the kind of thinness that suggested either exceptional genetics or concerning habits, chimed in with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. Victoria's being diplomatic. What she means is that this event attracts a certain type. You know, people who fit the brand we're trying to project. The third woman, older than the others but fighting age with every expensive weapon available, added with false sympathy. It's nothing personal, dear. It's just that we have to think about optics, about how things look, about maintaining standards. Standards, optics, brand. The words were code, and everyone present knew what they were code for. The black woman felt heat rising up her neck, spreading across her face, but she didn't look away. She held their gazes one by one, reading the comfort in their cruelty, the ease with which they wielded exclusion like a social grace. Around them, other guests had begun to notice the exchange. Some turned away, suddenly fascinated by the art on the walls or the bubbles in their champagne. Others watched with barely concealed curiosity, the kind of interest people have in minor social catastrophes they don't intend to intervene in. No one stepped forward to defend her. No one questioned the women who were questioning her right to exist in this space. A man in an expensive suit, something Italian, perfectly tailored to his athletic frame, joined the growing circle. His smile was all teeth, white and sharp. Ladies, is there a problem here? Just a small confusion, Victoria said smoothly. We were just explaining that this event has certain expectations, certain requirements for attendees. The man nodded sagely, as if this made perfect sense. Of course, of course. I mean, not everything needs to be about forced inclusion, does it? Sometimes it's just about maintaining quality. Good sense. Knowing what fits and what doesn't. Another man, this one older with silver hair and the kind of tan that came from tropical vacations rather than manual labor, added with a low chuckle. Exactly. There's a reason why certain establishments maintain their reputation. It's not discrimination, it's curation. The black woman listened to them explain away her dignity with practiced ease, their words polished smooth from frequent use. She could feel her heart pounding, could feel the weight of every assumption they were making about her, every conclusion they'd drawn before she'd even spoken a word. Perhaps, Victoria said, her voice taking on an almost maternal tone that somehow made everything worse, it would be better if you excused yourself now, before this becomes more awkward than it needs to be. We can call you a car if you'd like. No hard feelings, just a simple misunderstanding. The circle around her had grown tighter, their faces arranged in expressions of reasonable concern, as if they were doing her a favor, as if humiliation was a kindness when delivered with proper etiquette. She took a slow breath, feeling it fill her lungs, steady her racing heart, and then she did something none of them expected. No, she said, her voice clear and firm, carrying across the marble floors and high ceilings. I'm not leaving. The smiles faltered. Victoria's eyes widened slightly, surprise breaking through her polished composure for just a moment. Excuse me, the silver-haired man said, his tone sharpening. I said no. The black woman straightened even more. If that was possible, her presence suddenly taking up more space than her body occupied. I have every right to be here. I was invited. I'm staying. The murmur that rippled through the nearby guests was almost audible, like wind through dry leaves. This wasn't how these things usually went. Usually, people who were made to feel unwelcome simply left, slipping away to avoid further embarrassment, choosing dignity through absence rather than dignity through confrontation. Victoria's face hardened. Now there's no need to make a scene. I'm not the one making a scene, the black woman interrupted, her voice still calm but with steel underneath. I'm simply standing here, existing. You're the ones who seem to have a problem with that. Before Victoria could respond, the energy in the room shifted again. It started as a subtle change, people straightening, adjusting their positions, conversations stuttering and reforming. Heads began to turn toward the entrance, phones emerging from pockets and clutches, whispers changing tone and urgency. He had arrived. The man who walked through the gallery entrance didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. Power like his didn't require introduction. It preceded him like a change in air pressure before a storm. He was tall, his bearing suggesting military training somewhere in his past, though now his battles were fought in boardrooms and through carefully structured deals that moved billions with the stroke of a pen. His suit was bespoke but understated, the kind of quality that people with real wealth recognized, and people trying to appear wealthy never quite achieved. His face was handsome in a weathered way, with lines that suggested both intelligence and the burden of significant decisions made over years. But what struck people most was his focus. His eyes moved across the room with the efficiency of someone who knew how to assess situations quickly and completely. And they landed immediately on her. He walked directly to his wife, crossing the marble floor with purposeful strides, his path taking him right through the circle of people who'd been surrounding her with their polite cruelty. They parted without being asked, something in his approach making space automatically. When he reached her, he didn't look at anyone else. He studied her face, the set of her jaw, the controlled breathing, the way her hands gripped her clutch just slightly too tightly. He read the entire situation in her expression, in the tension around her eyes, in the way she was holding herself together through force of will. He took her hand gently, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture of both comfort and solidarity. "Are they treating you well?" he asked quietly, though his voice carried enough that those nearby could hear. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked around at the faces that had been so confident moments ago, now showing varying degrees of uncertainty and dawning comprehension. She looked at Victoria, whose complexion had gone from rosy confidence to ashen anxiety in the span of seconds. Her silence was more eloquent than any words could have been. Her husband nodded once, understanding complete. He turned slowly to face the group that had, just minutes ago, been smiling with such easy arrogance. "Interesting," he said, the single word somehow containing volumes. "Because I was under the impression that guests at this event would be treated with respect. Apparently I was mistaken about the character of some in attendance." "Mr. Richardson," Victoria stammered, her carefully constructed poise crumbling like wet sand. We didn't. There must have been some confusion." "Oh, there's certainly confusion," he agreed, his tone remaining conversational, almost friendly, which somehow made it more menacing. "I'm confused about how anyone could look at my wife and think she didn't belong here." The word wife landed like a physical blow. Eyes widened, faces paled. Several people took involuntary steps backward. The silver-haired man who'd spoken about curation now looked like he might be sick. "Your wife? Mr. Richardson, I had no idea. Why would you need to know she was my wife to treat her with basic human dignity?" Richardson asked, genuine curiosity in his voice, as if this were truly a question he wanted answered. "Does courtesy only apply to people whose connections you recognize?" No one spoke. The question hung in the air, unanswerable because any honest response would confirm exactly what they'd been denying, that their treatment of her had been based entirely on their assumptions about her worth, her value, her right to occupy their space. Richardson continued, his voice still quiet but carrying clearly in the sudden silence that had fallen over this section of the gallery. Other guests were watching now, some surreptitiously, others openly, sensing that something significant was happening. "But since you seem interested in connections and credentials," he said, "let me provide some context. My wife isn't just a guest here tonight. She's the primary reason this event exists in its current form." Victoria's face went from pale to gray. "I don't understand. The foundation that organized this charity gala?" Richardson smiled. though there was no warmth in it. My wife is the largest private donor. Has been for 3 years. The art scholarships you were all celebrating earlier? She funds 80% of them personally. The community programs you were toasting with champagne that cost more per bottle than those programs receive in monthly donations? She's been the principal investor since their inception. He paused, letting this information settle, watching as comprehension and horror bloomed across faces that had been so certain of their superiority minutes ago. But here's what I find most interesting, he continued, and now there was an edge to his voice, a sharpness that suggested the conversational tone had been a courtesy that was rapidly expiring. She also happens to sit on the advisory board that determines which donors and sponsors continue to be associated with our philanthropic endeavors. And she has sole discretion over the guest lists for events she funds. The redhead who'd spoken about brand made a small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper, which means, Richardson concluded, she has complete authority to decide who receives invitations to gatherings like this one, and, more relevantly at the moment, who never receives such invitations again. The threat wasn't veiled. It was delivered with perfect clarity, with the kind of calm that indicated it wasn't a threat at all, but simply a statement of fact, of power, of consequence. Victoria found her voice, though it came out thin and desperate. Mr. Richardson, please. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. I never meant to imply. We were simply trying to maintain the integrity of... The integrity of what? His wife asked, speaking for the first time since her husband had arrived. Her voice was steady now, strengthened by his presence but not dependent on it. Please finish that thought. The integrity of what, exactly? Victoria's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, unable to complete a sentence that wouldn't condemn her further. The black woman, Mrs. Richardson, released her husband's hand and took a step forward, addressing not just Victoria but the entire group that had participated in or witnessed her humiliation. I didn't stay because I needed to prove anything to you, she said, her words measured and clear, each one chosen with precision. I didn't stay because I was waiting for my husband to validate my right to exist in this space. I stayed because I wanted to see exactly how far you would go when you thought no one important was watching. She looked at each of them in turn. Victoria, the redhead, the silver-haired man, the one with the too white smile, all the others who had participated with words or complicit silence. I wanted to know if your courtesy was real or conditional. If your values extended beyond people who looked like you, people whose worth you could immediately recognize, people who fit your narrow definition of what belonging looks like. Her voice didn't rise, didn't break, didn't waver. And you showed me exactly who you are. You showed me that your politeness is a performance, that your charity is conditional, that your inclusion has prerequisites that have nothing to do with character or contribution, and everything to do with appearance and assumption. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ambient noise of the gallery seemed to have faded. No clinking glasses, no murmured conversations from other groups, no clicking of heels on marble. Everyone within earshot was listening now, bearing witness to a reckoning that was both personal and systemic. So yes, Mrs. Richardson continued, a smile finally touching her lips, though it held no humor, only a kind of grim satisfaction. You went too far. You revealed yourselves completely, and now you'll have to live with the consequences of that revelation. She turned to her husband, her expression softening slightly as she looked at him. I think I'm ready to leave now. He nodded, offering his arm, which she took with natural grace. As they turned to go, he paused, looking back at the group one final time. The Foundation will be reviewing all of tonight's attendees, he said conversationally. We'll be making some adjustments to our association lists. I'm sure you understand. We have standards to maintain, image to consider, the importance of proper curation. He used their own words against them with surgical precision, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone. As the Richardsons walked away together, moving through the gallery toward the exit, the crowd parted before them like water. No one spoke. No one tried to apologize or explain or make amends. They simply watched, understanding that something irreversible had just occurred, that there were some moments that couldn't be walked back or explained away. In the week that followed, Changes rippled through the city's social landscape with quiet but devastating efficiency. Photographs disappeared from the foundation's website and promotional materials. Certain faces that had been prominently featured in charity event coverage were suddenly absent from new publications. Invitations to upcoming galas and fundraisers failed to arrive in mailboxes that had previously been guaranteed such honors. Names that had long been fixtures on exclusive guest lists simply vanished, their absence noted, but never officially explained. Event planners who called to inquire about specific guests for their own functions received polite but firm responses. "I'm afraid they're no longer associated with our organization." No elaboration, no details, just a simple statement of fact that nevertheless conveyed volumes. Victoria Hastings found herself removed from every charitable board she'd served on, her memberships in prestigious clubs quietly revoked during routine reviews of membership criteria. The redhead who'd laughed about brand discovered that several business opportunities she'd been counting on had mysteriously evaporated. The silver-haired man learned that his company's sponsorship of certain cultural events was no longer needed, a decision that cost him both money and the social capital such sponsorships had provided. They tried to fight it at first. Calls were made, connections leveraged, explanations attempted. But the Richardsons didn't respond to any of it. There were no confrontations, no public accusations, no dramatic exposures, just the quiet, inexorable closing of doors that had previously stood open, the withdrawal of access to spaces and circles that had once seemed guaranteed. Some people understood immediately what had happened and why. Others took longer to piece it together, hearing rumors and whispers about an incident at the gallery that had somehow resulted in a significant reshuffling of the social order. A few never quite grasped the full picture, knowing only that they'd somehow fallen from grace, without understanding the exact mechanism of their fall. But those who had been present that night understood perfectly. They'd seen the moment when assumptions collided with reality, when casual cruelty met actual consequence, when people who believed themselves untouchable learned otherwise. The message was clear, even if it was never explicitly stated. Dignity is not conditional. Respect is not a privilege to be granted based on appearance or assumption. And there are people who have both the power and the will to enforce that principle when it's violated. Mrs. Richardson never spoke publicly about what had happened. She didn't need to. Her continued presence at carefully selected events, her ongoing support of genuine charitable work, her quiet expansion of programs that actually helped people rather than just making donors feel good about themselves. All of this spoke more clearly than any statement could have. And when she entered rooms now, conversations didn't die. Instead, they opened. People approached with genuine respect, with interest in her perspective, with recognition of her contributions that had nothing to do with who she was married to and everything to do with who she was. Because that night at the gallery, something important had been clarified for everyone present. It wasn't a black woman who had almost been expelled from a space she helped create. It was an entire system of casual exclusion that had been exposed, its mechanisms laid bare, its practitioners identified and held accountable. And in a world where wealth and power often insulate people from consequence, where social hierarchies feel immutable and unchallenged, that exposure mattered. It changed things, quietly but definitively, creating ripples that extended far beyond a single evening, far beyond a single group of people who'd learned a costly lesson about the danger of assumptions. The real victory wasn't in the revenge, the public humiliation, or the social exile of those who treated her poorly. The real victory was in what changed afterward, in the conversations that started about who belonged in spaces of power and privilege, in the questioning of assumptions that had gone unexamined for too long, in the slow but genuine expansion of circles that had been artificially narrow for far too long. Because Mrs. Richardson had done more than defend herself that night. She'd held up a mirror to an entire system, forcing people to see clearly what they'd been content to ignore. And that kind of clarity, once achieved, is almost impossible to unsee. The champagne at those events still tasted expensive. The art was still pretentious. The dresses still cost too much. But now, at least, there were more voices in the conversations, more faces in the photographs, more recognition that worth cannot be determined by appearance, that value cannot be measured by conformity to narrow standards, that belonging is not a gift to be granted by gatekeepers, but a right to be claimed by anyone willing to show up as their authentic self. And if some people found themselves on the outside of those conversations now, excluded from spaces they'd once dominated, perhaps they could take comfort in knowing exactly why, and knowing that their exclusion, unlike hers, was based not on who they were, but on what they'd chosen to do. That seemed, after all, like a fair and reasonable standard. If you liked this story, leave a like and subscribe for more.